So it's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening. There's some faces I recognize and some faces we wish to welcome especially. And I do hope that we can have a very stimulating discussion about this, one of the most, I have to say that this is certainly the sexiest book cover I've seen in a long time. And it really outcovers, if I can use that word, a lot of the other struggle, biography and autobiography of the last 20 years or so. So I'm going to begin, like a good lecturer, by talking a little bit about the book, with the expectation that most of you here will probably be encountering it for the first time. It's the autobiography of Amina Cachalia, who was born in 1930 and died very sadly earlier this year. And Ghaleb was just saying earlier that she lived to see the manuscript on computer in its layout form, but she didn't see how it was released. And having read the autobiography, I'm convinced that she would have liked the cover, and I think it's a really fantastic cover. There are a number of questions. I'm going to take this discussion through in the form of a conversation about the book and some of the issues which the book raises. The book is, it's about 414 pages for those of you who haven't seen it, and it deals with Amina's life, right from her early years up into what she calls the post-millennium period. And it's pretty much divided up into 7 parts, where each part reflects a decade, certainly in the later parts of the volume. And there's also some fantastic photographic material in the book. Many of Amina's own photographs, which help to show, I think, how tremendously important for her the people in her lives were. And the people, these were people in her own family, people who she interacted with at a political level, and in some cases the two were the same, and that's one of the things that becomes clear, is that there's no separation between the personal and the political in this volume. The book is divided up into a number of chapters which almost stand as vignettes of particular people. So for instance, she'll have a vignette about Bram Fischer, at the point in her life where he features very importantly. And this led me into thinking about how important this book is, because for the last 20 years or so, since the ending of apartheid and South Africa's first democratic government, one of the really interesting things that we've seen is an explosion, and I really think it's an explosion, of memoirs, autobiography, the personal writing, biography of people who were involved in struggling against apartheid. And a lot of the people who write find that the experience of writing for them is very, very cathartic. And you can see this in some of the autobiographies that are on offer. And this is perhaps, in some ways, one of the most interesting areas of access into South African history over the last 20 years, and also for the period before. Because what it does is it brings home that period of history in a way that brings it into our lives in the current moment, in a way in which a lot of dry history text can't do. And for many years I've been teaching a course with students which is based on the idea of using biography and autobiography as an historical source. And I have read many struggle biographies and autobiography, and this is one of the ones that I must say I've most enjoyed. And I think this is a characteristic of the book that sets it apart from some of the others that I've read. There's a joie de vivre here that really comes through, even in some of the most difficult moments in Amina and Yusuf's life. So having given a bit of an introduction, I thought what I'd do is actually start by asking Ghaleb and Coco how it was that their mother came to decide to write this book, and when it was exactly. You talk a bit about the writing in the book, the writing of the book in the book. And there's a wonderful piece by Hedwig Barry at the end of the book where she has the most amazing description of Amina, where she refers to her as a keeper of stories, which I think is wonderful. So when and how did your mom decide to start writing this book?
Oh, there's another one. Hello? That's better. I think, yeah. I think, Ghaleb, if I'm not wrong, that this book actually just started as a memoir for her grandchildren. She wanted to record her life. It, by and large, was a relatively interesting life, I think. It spanned a good number of years. It spanned a good number of years in South African history that were quite pivotal in lots of ways. And I think she wanted her grandchildren and her family to know some of what had been said. So I think that that was one of the reasons that she started. I think the other reason probably was that she did feel that by writing the book herself, she could also partially tell the story of my father, who never wrote his story down in any fashion. So I think that that, for me, was my understanding partly of why she chose to. It then grew and became quite a monster, which Ghaleb can tell you a little bit more about because he was much more directly involved with Amina in the final piece around this thing. But I think its origins were very much around that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Though it certainly began as a memoir for her grandchildren and then evolved into something bigger. Like every good struggle activist, she had an agenda. And she decided at some point that there's certain things that needed to be said, apart from the memoir for her grandchildren. And if you read the book, you'll encounter various things that she said. And I had many conversations with her about what she would say and should she say and should she not. And she wrote the book, I didn't by any means. I simply said to her, Ma, you can't have half a bath. Just have a bath and tell the book. And that's what she did.
I'm sure that Amina herself must have read many of the books that I'm thinking of, in the line of autobiography and biography. And I was wondering if there were any particular ones that stood out in her mind and helped her to think about writing the book. If there were any models, perhaps. I mean, I'm thinking now of a biography of Stephen Klingman's biography of Bram Fischer. Did she ever speak about any of these books or the way in which people were writing about their lives? Did she situate the writing of this book in terms of a broader, both literary and struggle program?
She certainly read all those books. These were all contemporaries of hers, they were friends of hers, and she would send me out to buy these books and she'd read them all religiously. I was never sure how much it actually influenced her. She'd use them for cross-referencing and fact-checking, and often remarked about how well that piece was written as opposed to that piece. But I didn't get beyond that with her.
One of the questions I did want to ask is, and you've already partially answered it, is whom did she hope that she was writing the book for? And you've talked about her grandchildren. Since the book's come out, what kind of encounters have you had with people where they've talked about the book? I mean, is there any sense that you have of an audience developing for this book? And what are people saying to you about this book?
You know, I think one of the biggest sadnesses about Amina's book, in some senses, is that Ghaleb and I have, largely because she's not here anymore and sadly died, are speaking on behalf of her about this book. But one thing I've missed completely is a proper book review. I actually haven't seen one. There have been lots of interviews with my brother and I. There have been lots of other bits and pieces around the book. But nobody's actually read the book from cover to cover and reviewed the book as a book in its own right. So I do find that missing. And then I think, as Ghaleb alluded to a little bit earlier, there are parts of this book where Amina tells it like she wants to tell it, and I think one of the strengths of the book is that her voice comes through so very strongly, and she speaks in a very matter-of-fact and quite non-judgmental way. So she'll say something, but she'll just say it and put it out there, and she doesn't make a comment about it necessarily at the end of the day. So I think there are people that might be a little bit upset with elements of this book, but I think because my mum died 3 months ago, they have not confronted me with any of that. So I hear, for example, and I can give you examples, the Cachalia family, some elements of the Cachalia family are very unhappy with parts of what has been written in the book, because she talks a lot about my uncle, Marvy, and she's got a very particular take on him. And I hear through the grapevine, I hear through all sorts of other people that the Cachalias are not very happy, but nobody's picked up the phone, or nobody has sent me an email, or nobody has said anything directly to me. And likewise in the other areas. And I think maybe it's partly a deference that she's no longer here, and maybe we're still somewhat in mourning, I'm not sure. But there's been no direct confrontation. So they have, in short, I've not really had a conversation with the people, some of the actors in the book. I have had conversations with lots of people who've commented more generally about the book and have spoken and said how they liked it or what they found difficult or whatever. Yeah.
I think Coco touched on a very important point in that, as she says, there hasn't been, that we've seen particularly, a proper review of the book. And I've been cognizant of this and often thought, even though it's not my place necessarily, that I might write one. But then I've been so close to the book that it might not be the right thing to do. But because of the absence of that sort of interaction or intervention, it did occur to me. But to answer your other point, in conversation with her, I asked, who are you writing this for? She said, for my grandchildren, for people who are interested as a testament to my life. Not that my life was terribly important, but she said I lived in interesting times and met interesting people. And then she said, very tellingly to me, she said, but I suppose at the bottom of all this, I'm writing this for women. And I think that came across quite clearly.
I think you're right. I mean, some of the particularly, well, there's a passage in the book that I particularly like where she talks about how, I think it was with your birth, Coco, or no, I think with your birth, Ghaleb, she was trying to hang up the nappies and found them too heavy, and talked about the lack of disposable nappies in those days, and how your dad went up on the top of the building of flats and hung up the nappies, and a delegation of women came to visit her and say, no, 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 you can't let Yusuf hang up these nappies. And she thought, and this was in late 1956, early 1957, she'd participated in the Women's March to Pretoria the year before, and some of the women who were remonstrating with her about Yusuf hanging up the nappies were the very women that she'd been attempting, and she used the word to conscientize. So I thought that was a very telling piece, and it's clear through the book that she found her early work with women particularly important. And I suppose one of the areas where the book might raise a few eyebrows is in her descriptions of the ANC Women's League, because it's clear she's really, really upset with the ANC Women's League and how it fails to live up to its promise in the, its potential promise in the post-apartheid period. And if we take that theme about women's issues further, I wondered if you had anything to say about that in particular. Did she talk about that in particular? It comes up in one of those sections where she's talking about the difficulties between her and Winnie Madikizela Mandela, for instance.
My mum never really spoke in themes, and I think Coco alluded to this in the book. She would never dream of writing and talking about the double oppression of women in South Africa. She would talk about an experience. While Yusuf was hanging up the washing and someone came to demonstrate about her, and she'd say, "Don't be silly, there's nothing wrong with men doing it." So it came out of her experience. There was no didacticism, there's no particular telling a story for a particular point of view. It was her life, and there were meaning that that people could draw out of certain experiences and junctures. And similarly with the Women's League, there were times when or her interaction with women in South Africa in general. You'll read about her times with Helen Joseph and visiting the banished people, which came across very strongly, and how important that was for her. And she just described what happened. And similarly, she would describe her disappointment with certain aspects of her interaction with organizations. But there was no, it was just, you know, as part of the story. This is my life. I know if it's interesting for you, pick up on it, sort of thing. Yeah.
I mean, there's often a question that sort of in my women's group circles sort of asked, was my mother a feminist? And I'm really not sure how to answer the question in some ways. I think my mother's life, in a lot of ways, was very much about women, and as the book tells you, a lot of her later life was shaped by her earlier interventions around what she believed. And I mean, I think it was quite interesting that in the 40s or early 50s when she was doing this, to see that actually financial capability amongst women, and particularly amongst young Indian women at that point, was actually a really important thing that would set you apart. So I guess I would say, yes, intrinsically my mother was a feminist. I think she was very contradictory. I think she was contradictory along the lines that the struggle happened, you know, the role of women in the 50s, whether it was a feminist movement, whether it was there to support the men in the struggle, whether it was there to support the National Democratic, you know, we can debate all of those issues. I think Amina's life just documents as it goes along that path and those contradictions along the way. And I think in the end, yes, I mean, she did. I mean, it's very strongly comes out in lots of ways that her support for women was always at heart what she was about.
Shortly, I want to follow up on two of the comments that you made, one of which is that she documents as she goes along, which is very evident in the book, and the other is about the themes. But I'd like to stay on the issue of women, but take it in a slightly different direction for the moment. Because one of the wonderful things about the book is the way in which Amina talks about her family and her extended networks. So I'm switching away from the politics, although the two are connected for the moment. She talks a lot about her older sister, for instance, who was in an arranged marriage. If I've got that right. Yes, yes. And she talks about her own mother. She talks about her sister Zainab, who was one of only 2 Indian women at Wits in the late 1940s. And was not allowed to eat. The Indian students at that time were not allowed to eat or socialize with the white students on campus. But I was really interested in the character of her mother, Fatima, who seems to be such an essential and key part of Amina's life. And I would have liked to have, in a sense, read more about her fascinating sounding origins, and also what memories you yourself have of her. I think that would be really nice.
The Asvat women, of which my mother was the youngest, were an incredibly hardy and strong bunch. Going back to her grandmother, Oma de Bruyn, who married this Indian merchant who was a close associate of Gandhi's in those days, through to Fatma, her mother, who was an old school, no-nonsense lady who brought up, when her husband died early, 11 children single-handedly. She lived with us for many years. She was a remarkable lady. She would wake up in the morning and her day would start with a cup of tea and reading the Rand Daily Mail. Fatima, there were very few women of that generation who began their days like that. Appa, even though she was in this arranged marriage and quite conservative and so on, shouldered all the responsibility as the eldest woman of bringing up all the children together with her mother. Zainab was an incredibly strong political activist and a very competent doctor, obstetrician and gynecologist. Haju, who married a simple merchant herself, is alive, as is Zainab, and a very strong woman who brooks no nonsense. These were tough ladies, and they lived their life very, very, very strongly. Perhaps you want to add, Coco.
Personally, I think the women in the Aswad family put the men to shame. But that's my view. Yeah, my grandmother was, I mean, she lived with us for many years. She shared, my aunt Zainab lived next door to us, and we kind of shared a joint property, and she moved between the two. And my earliest memories of my grandmother was this totally feisty, diminutive, even shorter than my mother kind of woman, who took on the security police, who took on my father when she chose to, took on my uncle. She really was, she was a strong woman, yeah.
One of the really poignant anecdotes in the book describes how Amina and Yusuf were living next door to her sister, to Zainab, when they were under banning orders and the two families were not supposed to interact. Which takes me into one of the other things I wanted to speak about, which is, although you say there are no specific themes in the book, I see certain themes emerge. One of which for me is the indignity, at the same time the way that people found ways of working around the pettiness of apartheid. And I'm not just speaking about apartheid in general, I'm thinking particularly of things like the Prohibition on Mixed Marriages Act, which affected, or almost affected your father in his second marriage, and affected you yourself. But the everyday indignities visited on personal family life by people who are trying to go about their business. And that came to me very clearly in that vignette I talked about, where the two families were living next door to each other in a semi-detached house, and yet they weren't supposed to be speaking to each other. And the degrees to which friends and comrades tried to help them circumvent these. And I suppose my question here is about, how do you remember any of that? Amina, one of the things that she doesn't really do so much in the book is speak about her feelings. She does in places, but often it's more about others' feelings. How did she feel about that?
I mean, I think living in those times, I mean, as we were growing up, and what from I can remember, already the exile years were in place. So all the close friends and comrades were either in jail or were out of the country. There were few and far between that were left behind. So they relied, my mother, I mean, it was lonely times. I mean, my parents, my father was house arrested, my mother was banned, my aunt and uncle were banned next door to us. So there were no visitors that were allowed in the house. It was a strange upbringing, I mean, we did. But we did circumvent, and I think the one big difference for us was, and perhaps it is a little bit of a difference between the kind of the black families that were left behind as opposed to the white families, where I think there was a lot more of an ostracization that happened. So the support in the community was not nearly as strong as we got. I mean, we felt like we were kings and queens because we had a mother and father who were house arrested and banned, who were politically involved at that time, who were struggling and were doing things. And the support of the community kind of mitigated against this. And you know, this fact that my aunt and uncle were living next door to us and they couldn't speak to them was meaningless. I mean, they spoke all the time. There was a whole charade that went on outside. There was a code for ringing a doorbell, for checking out if the little green Volkswagen was parked up the road, who was the security policeman. You know, we managed that. And although it was an odd existence, it was an existence that I certainly never felt particularly strange about. I mean, it was what it was, and I felt perfectly fine with it.
No, I must agree with Coco. You used the word indignity. We grew up in Fordsburg, in Friedel, Fitas, as it was called then. And these indignities were present in everyone's life, more so in many other people's lives. We wore these indignities like a badge of pride, because, and stock phrase which might seem trite now, when people ask, what do your parents do? I said, well, what do? They fight for freedom. And we deal with these indignities and we find creative ways around them. And that's how we dealt with it.
I don't know if we've answered your question.
Well, the other thing that interested me about the book is the way in which you put it. She sets things down. She doesn't particularly moralize. I mean, there are a couple of places where it's clear that people do things that she really disapproves of. And I'm thinking of the incident with Adelaide Tambo. When Adelaide Tambo phones up Amina in the 1990s and basically asks to borrow a lot of money. And Amina clearly is indignant at this, but she just puts it down in a particularly matter-of-fact voice. There's another piece that I like particularly, which, moving on to a slightly different subject, is where she talks about the fact that when she married Yusuf, he was in fact still married to Betty. Yes, and she says she has a great genius for understatement. And this is a quote from the book. She says, there was the little matter of his marriage to Betty. So little matter of his marriage to Betty. And then she calmly admits to the fact that for the first few months of their marriage, they were married bigamously. But it's that matter-of-factness which I think is so nice about the book, because it just puts something down and it leads you to take further, take what you want to take from that particular interaction. In some ways, although your mother is trying to write about your father, it doesn't necessarily always come through so well in the book, I think because she's trying to cover so many different bases. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about, perhaps, and I'm moving away from the book for a moment, about your experiences of your father. And then, since you've already been placed in the position of having to speak to your mother, who's no longer around, what do you think your father would have thought of the book?
I think my father would have been very proud of the book, and a bit in the writing of it, he'd suffered probably a little bit of trepidation as to how he may have been treated. But my mother was very clear that one of her intentions, and it may not have come through 100% as you say, is that she was very cognizant and clear in her own mind that in her view she was a young activist who came out of a very interesting family, who was born into aspects of the struggle, who married my father and then continued her life in that vein. She was very clear in her head that while she was, in her own words, junior activist, my father was far from a junior activist. He was a very senior member of the liberation struggle. And she felt very clearly in her mind that this has been for a host of reasons. And she alludes to them cryptically in the book, that this has been forgotten, sometimes just forgotten, other times purposefully. And she wanted to write that memory in many ways. And that was clear in her mind. How it came across, because of her closeness to the subject and to the man, is complex, but there you have it.
My mother and father were totally different personalities. My mother was a completely feisty, out there, glamorous, all of that person. My father was very much a philosopher, a thinker, somebody that sat in the armchair with his whiskey and his cigarette holder and pontificated and thought and spoke. So there was my memories of my father are of a deep thinker, but also of a very ever-present father. which sometimes my mother wasn't an ever-present mother, actually. She was quite busy out there. My father did have the handicap of being house arrested. So from 6 in the evening to 6 the next morning, he was at home. Amina sometimes wasn't always at home. So I remember him as a very strong personality in my life. And you know, even when I went away to boarding school at the age of 12 or 13, it was often my father that I had quite deep conversations with about being a young girl and about being all sorts of things. It was with my father and not always with my mother. So that's my memories of my father.
One of the other things that struck me about the book is how often Amina seems to be visiting or trying to visit people in prison. Different prisons. So it's almost a potted history of different South African prisons, from Pollsmoor to Victor Verster. Her description of waiting in the combi when on the day that Nelson Mandela is released from prison. But there are also other descriptions of prison, how she talks about how her sister Zainab was imprisoned during the protests in Durban in the late 1940s. And then how some of Yusuf's descriptions of prison. And I wonder if you ever talked about these things at home, because these must have been immensely disruptive events in people's lives. And again, it's one of those unconscious themes, I think, in the book, which shows up how apartheid affected different people's lives.
I think because of my mother and father's strength in their personalities and the immensely warm and together home they had with and for us, that we were, when they went to use that word indignity again, prison I suppose is one of the ultimate indignities, when they went to prison, or anybody went to prison, it was not so much an indignity, it was something, again, that you dealt with, and that was a badge of pride in many ways. So we would, I can remember my mother driving us to Leeuwkop prison to visit my father, there was no memory of my father being treated badly or anything of the sort. The memories are quirky. I remember a dead snake in the car park, which was interesting to a boy. I remember visiting them in the fort and being given by a fellow prisoner, Marvi Saluji, Cheryl sweets through the bars. Those are the sort of memories. The fact that people who were in prison, we took in our stride. Yes, we talked about things. I mean, when I was arrested once, it helped me to a degree in that my father said to me some time before, he said, do you know how you must deal with warders and policemen? He says, you mustn't ask, you mustn't beg, you mustn't be frightened. You must give them orders, because that's the only thing they understand. and you know, there I was taken to John Foster Square and taken up the lift after spending a night there, going to the security cop taking me to a floor and saying, I want to introduce you to the armored Timor wing, which is where they threw him off, and thought he was going to frighten me. And I was emboldened by my father's words. So when he came down, when he sat me down to interrogate me, I said, I'm not talking unless you bring me a cup of tea. And lo and behold, he did. And that was my father.
One of the things that the book speaks about at length is your mother's relationship with Nelson Mandela. And I know that the two of you have also spoken about this in other fora, because there are certain things that she leaves out of the book. And I've read about how you questioned her on why she chose to leave some of this out. But I think probably for the audience here who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, it might be nice to hear about a little bit of that detail, I think, and to reflect on why she chose to put in some bits and leave out other bits.
I get past the I'm not sure. I'm not sure. As I said, I encouraged my mother to have a bath, not half a bath, and she chose to say what she chose to say. These were personal and delicate subjects, and she, I suppose like most authors, said it in the saying and the unsaying. I cannot really tell you why and how she did it. That's her secret, and it's gone to her grave with her.
You know, I agree with Ghaleb. I mean, I think my mother said in the book as much as she wanted to. I think perhaps she might have said less at some point, and I think it was even more cryptic. And I think when Ghaleb in particular, even when the publisher looked at the manuscript, it didn't really make sense if you were going to say nothing in a sense, but you were alluding to something. So I think in the end she did say more, but I think she never was going to say everything. It's interesting, there's going through her apartment where she lived at the back of our house now, we came across a little manuscript of a slightly different version of some of the Mandela chapters.
I'll tell you about that.
Yeah, and it's quite, it went much more into his life and what she believed were his issues, and it was quite an interesting read.
Yeah. I sat down with her and the publisher, and we said, this is all very cryptic, and you're saying some things of potential big interest to people out there. You have to be more forthcoming, Ma. And she said, well, I said what I'm going to say. So I said, well, look, can I suggest that you write, not for publication, and this is maybe what Coco found, a script about what happened for our edification so that we can understand it, and then we can perhaps ask you questions, and you can perhaps revisit certain things in the book to bring them out, and that's what we did.
But I do think in the end it was very much my mother's story about her interaction. And I think that's what's in the book. That's what it is.
I've been told to keep this down to about 40 minutes so that we can take some questions. So I wanted to ask, just before I finish, if there's anything you wanted to say about the book that you haven't already discussed, because I mean we could go on for a long time talking about this. I think that some of the things that I liked particularly were your mother's descriptions, for instance, of food and the curries, and there is one vignette in which Nelson phones up to say, Mandela phones up to say that he's coming around because he wants to eat some of Amina's food, and she feels that there's nothing in the house, so sends someone rushing out to the restaurant to get takeaway. And all of these delightful stories which bring people that for some of us might be quite exalted and quite revered into a very personal space with us. So we could go on talking for a long time, but is there anything that you particularly would like to say about this book?
Look, I mean, I think in the end we're very happy that the book was written. It is a wonderful legacy that my mother's left for us, and we're very proud, well, I'm certainly very proud of the book. I think sometimes, and I mean I did discuss with this early on, but I think this book became such a big thing in my mother's life, and she needed to finish it, and I think she had almost a premonition that she wasn't going to be around for much longer after this book, so it was a big thing to get the book done. So to her to go back, I think those early chapters, if she'd fleshed them out a little bit more, if we got a little bit more of a picture being painted of the family, of that early life, of the interactions in the community. So sometimes it's lost on people, because if you don't know the characters in the book, you don't really get the full understanding of what she was talking about. So I would have liked to have seen a little bit more depth there, but what is here is what is here, and I'm delighted.
I'd like to say two things. One is related to what Coco spoke about, and the other is completely extraneous. And the extraneous one is just an interesting thing. She wrote that book entirely in longhand. Coco's right. You'll see in the book, very rich visually. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. We had to go through, my mother was a great hoarder of documents and photographs, and there are reams of the stuff that we have now catalogued. And I want to, and I'm going to, get some people to do a photographic and visual exhibition of the work there, which in many ways visually will fill the gaps of the written word that Coco was talking about, and I think that would be quite interesting.
Well, I think that what I would like to say is that it's clear from the way that your mother wrote is that she had a tremendous sense of fun. But she combined it with immense empathy for people. And I think that what she did is a really great piece, and I'm certainly going to be recommending it to my students. Thank you.